My name is William Jefferson Black. I'm the publisher of Transaction Advisors and the host of our M&A Methods interview series. Welcome to the latest edition. I'm pleased to have Svetlana Vinokur with me today from Federal Signal. And she has not only spoken at our M&A conference in the past at the University of Chicago, but has agreed to join us today to share some war stories, some perspective and insights on both the practice and the techniques that she's used both effectively and those that have been challenges in doing deals both on the buy and on the sell side. As a starting point, can you tell us a little bit about what was your charter when you were hired and what was your job on day one when you joined Federal Signal?
Absolutely. Let me tell you a little bit more about Federal Signal. So it's a 100-year-old company that have a lot of history of M&A, good and bad history of M&A. And in the mid-2000s, they found themselves had a perfect storm and got themselves in trouble. And Jennifer, our current CEO, led the successful turnaround of the company. And when I joined in 2015, we were kind of in those crossroads to figure out who we want to be when we grow up as a 100-year-old company. And so our balance sheet was strong, and we were, as a management team, working on developing our long-term strategy. And that strategy involved both organic and inorganic paths, and that's what we focused on. The fun part of my job as I started was to really get to know the businesses, get to know the management, and partner with them, make them part of the process to see whom they want to grow up when they grow up, and so then how M&A can help them to achieve that. Because very often, how to get from A to B, you can do it in different ways, right? And sometimes organic is better than inorganic. And so those discussions are very helpful to have with the people that are actually managing the business right now and will be managing the business going forward.
Interesting. Let's talk for a minute, if we could, about private equity. Because let's start on the buy side. Mm-hmm. In the last 10 years, the amount of dry powder that's been accumulated is staggering. It's just an incredible amount. And so they're pretty active participants. And I guess as a starting point, do you compete against them in every deal on the buy side? Is there always a private equity buyer?
I would say that yes and no.
Okay.
If it's a traditional kind of sales process, yes, we will see that, especially if it's a sponsor to sponsor. Like if it's a sponsor-owned company, the probability we'll see other sponsors involved very high, right? But having private equity is kind of a double-edged sword. They hurt us, but they also help us a lot. Because we can really differentiate ourselves against private equity when it comes to private companies in particular. Because for private companies, we find that it's probably 70% price and 30% those intangibles about the culture, the people, the legacy. Right. And so on those soft aspects, we can be much more attractive to the private company than a private equity. And we have been very successful in using that and cultivating that in our M&A process. And since we have private companies that we bought and the management team still with us, we have a really good track record that every private company we talk to, we invite them to have a conversation with the other companies that we purchase that are part of us. And that's been very, very, very successful. And Jennifer and the team and I, we spent a lot of time cultivating those relationships and really making sure that they're comfortable that whatever they build will find a good home.
Do you tend to be less comfortable with acquisitions that are sponsor owned, that have been under private equity ownership, Well, I thought you might be. Now let's spend a minute on that.
I have my biases, right?
Well, and that's good to understand because
you know, I admire private equities for what they do when they come into the companies, right? They really can bring a lot of good structure and processes and kind of driving companies to perform, right? On the flip side, you know, cash is king, right? Yes. And so they have a not always long-term incentive to invest in the business and do what's right for the business for 10 years down the road, right? And so what we find in acquisitions that we have done that have been owned by private equity, when we go in that environment, we assume that there's some investments that will need to be done that haven't been done, some people investment that will need to be done. And so as long as you kind of counter that into what you're doing, you are okay. And I would say the other thing is the cultural aspect. So on the last acquisitions that we have done, it's been the company that's been owned by private equities for a while and been flipped a couple of times, and we are a very people culture, right? It's very important to us. And on the day of the announcement of the acquisition, the entire management team, all 6 of us, embarked on the trip to visit every single facility in 3 days to say hi to employees. They had 800 employees and in 6 facilities in the middle of nowhere. And so we had to fly in, drive for 2 hours for each facility. And we chose to do that, and we got incredible feedback from people because they appreciated that human touch, that Federal Signal is not just another owner, it's actually their home, that they will be there for a while. And it was very tough. It was 3 days. I think it was 15 flights and probably 7 states. And they calculated that our average speed of movement was 50 miles an hour, and that's including the sleep time. But the feedback we got from all the even floor employees that how much they appreciated that was very important. And so we do that on every single acquisition. When we announce, we come in, we make sure they know who we are, what we stand for, and that they are part of our family now.
Thank you to our underwriter Intralinks. From IPOs to spin-offs, restructurings, and mergers and acquisitions, Intralinks provides a best-in-class platform for your next transaction. Looking beyond those steps in the process, how much, if at all, do you like to get involved then in the integration or the oversight or coaching or guidance of post-performance?
Well, I'm personally really involved in that. So on the largest acquisition we have done in the company's history last year, I actually led the integration as well. And so it was me and the CEO of the company we acquired, and that worked really well. And we do that on every single acquisition. We make sure there is someone from Federal Signal and then from the company we're acquiring. So then we bring 2 teams together. And on this one, we actually brought the integration team together even before we closed. So we had a 3-day session in Chicago where we all got to know each other, right, on the personal level. So what we do is we look at each function individually and on each transaction and see what makes sense to integrate and what doesn't make sense to integrate, right? So we have a list of things that we will look at, but there's no prescriptive kind of a way of how we're going to go about it. So it's not like when you become Federal Signal, you need to go in our medical, right? Or you need to have the same benefits, or you need to go on the same ERP system. So it's all a reviewed case-by-case basis on the acquisition.
You've probably got some exposure to leaks during this period of time. In your career, have you had to address deal leaks that obviously happened before closing in a way that was disruptive?
Well, so a lot of, before we announced the deal, we tried to keep it very, very quiet, right? So, for us, we are very vocal about that M&A is a big part of our story.
Sure.
And so I think the investor community kind of knows that we are working on something, right? They just not necessarily know what it will be, sure, but they know what we are working, and we are pretty explicit on what strategies we are pursuing. So what type of companies we might be interested in. So I think from that perspective, we are kind of, there's no, when we announce the deal, right, there's not necessarily surprised that we're announcing the deal, right? So, but we follow kind of the same procedures probably a lot of companies follow. You try to limit the amount of people you talk to, sessions where we discuss what didn't work.
Have
right?
you ever leaked intentionally a deal or been a part of a deal team?
No.
No? Okay.
No. So it's kind of, sometimes it unintentionally happens because sometimes some people will send an email copying the wrong person, right? And you unintentionally will know who else is in the process, right? So that happened in our last deal, kind of, that we probably learned information we didn't have to, right? So that happens.
But not as a technique
not
or a
as a
tactic to apply
technique,
pressure.
because at the end of the day, I think it will come back to bite you,
Yeah.
right? Because if you are doing this, you will end up being on the receiving end of it, right?
Sure.
So we haven't seen kind of that type of. I know sometimes people do that to build up kind of the demand for the company, kind of, right, as a tactic, right? And so we have seen that
Sure.
kind of play out, but as long as you know kind of what's going on,
Sure.
you just work.
Well,
with it.
and I gather that more professional, more rigorous process, and in particular with regard to access and communication, is even more critical when you're divesting a business, because early in your tenure, one of your first transactions was the divestiture, right? So can you talk us through a little bit of the war story and the experience and sort of lessons learned there?
It was a very interesting, actually, transaction. It was the business we had in Finland that was it was a really good business, but went through kind of operational challenges, and it was the business that did not fit well with Federal Signal strategy anymore. And we were kind of in the process of turning it around, wanted to improve operationally and then to divest it. And in the midst of this kind of operational turnaround, we got approached by a Japanese buyer, who for them it was very strategic, right? And they have never done transaction outside of Japan, right? Because culturally, it's very different how you do deals in Japan and here. Sure. It's very different how do you negotiate and communicate, right? And so, and then what they feel is important and not, right? And so for instance, we are very kind of much biased about asset deal versus stock deals because we don't want to get any liabilities, sure, right? The historical, and either through their inexperience or kind of they care less about it, right? So or kind of this business was selling a lot of product all over the world in the countries that as a U.S. company. We felt we were exposing ourselves, and they had very different standard than U.S. public companies, so which made them a much better buyer and much better owner of the business than we did.
Well, and that's always, and this came up at our last M&A conference at the Wharton campus in San Francisco, this notion of fit and focus and highest and best use of that capital. And so, I think one of the predictions that we've been debating and discussing around the office here is whether or not we're going to see more divestitures in the future as people look at questions of fit and focus and highest and best use of invested capital. What's your prediction? You think we'll see more divestitures?
We go through the cycles, right? Quite honestly, and I think the businesses constantly evaluating their portfolio, right? And I know when Federal Signal went through that, 5 years ago we had 4 divisions, right? And our story was so complex to investors, right? And as we looked at our portfolio and we divested 2, right? And we focus on the two platforms that we see the most strategic growth going forward. But it also simplified the story for investors. I think that's becoming more and more important. Investors want to they want to understand your story. They want to understand where you're going, and the complexity of having too many different parts and too many different things that don't necessarily jive together is not attractive to them anymore. This diversified industrials kind of are probably out of favor right now, but and I think that will continue for at least for some period of time. The challenge becomes is how do you grow, right? So, and I think that's where we start seeing more diversification, because when companies have challenges growing organically or growing within their markets that they identify, they almost have to look outside, right? And by when you start looking outside, that's when you start acquiring things that are further and further away from your core.
Sure. Well, if we were to, when we sit here again 10 years from now.
Hopefully I'm retired by then. But
well, and you've been obviously even more successful at that point than you have been today. What do you think what will we be talking about? What's going to be different about the corporate development process and role in 10 years' time, would you say?
I told you earlier that I love and hate private equities, right? Because they are constantly pushing the envelope, right? And pushing an envelope sometimes in a good, sometimes not in a good way, right? So, and how we what type of product we use to help us get to the deals faster, like rapid warrant insurance, or some of those kind of things like related to working capital, right? So those things will continue to evolve, right? They will continue to evolve, and the banks will play a role depending kind of on the bank's willingness to land, right? And put the leverage. That will dictate kind of how strict or kind of less loose the buyers will be on their diligence, right? So and I personally believe that we will start paying more attention on culture and people and fit. Because if you look at the M&A transactions and in any industry, the transaction that failed really miserably, they didn't fail because people overpaid or because it was a bad product. They failed because the cultural fit was really bad, and the two organizations couldn't come together to make it work, right? They couldn't make it 1 + 1 = 3. They made 1 + 1 = 0.5.
We'll have a session at our next M&A conference at the University of Chicago on selling deals to proxy advisors, to institutional investors, to the financial media. And what I think we've done well is pair that with a follow-on session on navigating antitrust and regulatory reviews. Because of course, if one oversells the benefits of the deal, the ability to cram down price increases and other attributes, there's a balance, right? So I think we'll test out a good balance of properly messaging, and proper can mean a little bit.
And I always say M&A and kind of it's an art, right? It's not a science, and there are a lot of very technical things that come into it, right? But there are a lot of and I never saw it on myself as a sales and marketing person, but quite honestly, that's what I do, because you need to sell Federal Signal to the company you are acquiring. You need to sell their deal to your board, to your investors, to internal people, right? So,
well, you've given me a transition on art. Let's talk about art real quick. When you think about if we were having this in your office instead of Mars, I imagine there's some deal tombstones, some lucite and mementos. which is the most artistic, the most creative deal tombstone in your career?
Interesting. Well, I know that we had a remote dump truck as a deal toy.
Okay.
When I was early in my career, I sold the company that did the lifts that were going into the trains. So we had a really cool lucite.
I think a lot of us miss deal toys. I think we feel like we should bring these back more. But all right, how about?
And the last one I have is a bottle of wine from the French company when we did the deal.
Is there still wine in the bottle, or is this an empty?
No, there is still wine in the bottle.
Okay. Well, with that, why don't we wrap up for today? Appreciate very much the time and the conversation. It's always a joy, and thank you for your insights and your knowledge that obviously has been built up on such an impressive career. So thank you for being with us. Thanks again to our underwriter Intralinks, the leading virtual data room provider who supports 99% of the Fortune 1000 companies. From deal preparation, diligence, right through to closing. Find out more at Intralinks.com.